Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Renu Tyagi from Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi. Today, I will be discussing the module titled A Gradual Shift from Determinism to Possibilism. The learning objective of these modules are: number 1, to understand the concept of possibilism and determinism. Number 2, to understand the relationship between men and environment. And next, how environment set the culture of a man. We will be able to understand how culture is influenced by the environment. Now let's have a look at the introduction. The differentiation and establishment of a new subdiscipline in social sciences can ultimately be traced back to already existing ideas and orientations. Changing relations between culture and environment as well as changes within a culture give rise to new ways of looking at and conceptualizing the old truths. Ecological anthropology is a holistic approach. It deals with the interaction between environment, culture and human beings. Culture is a primary source for adaptation to environment. An ecological analysis of how people lived in the past and how they adapted. There is a dialectic relation between environment and culture, and it has its cause and effect. The roots of ecological anthropology are to be found in several different traditions of environmental explanation, some of which are tightly woven into Western thought. In this context, let's begin by examining these roots. Apparently, in recent years, human ecology has been given greater attention by the scientists and social scientists. A number of different conceptual approaches have been employed in the study of human ecology. Anderson in 1977 argues that the necessity to view man within the framework of his habit tended towards the adaptation of two fruitless positions that for long dominated the thoughts of social scientists. With some simplification, these positions can be seen as extremes on a continuum, one pole being the environmental determinism and the other cultural determinism. Their less extreme versions are known by the terms environmentalism and possibilism. Vidya and Rapport in 1968 tend to separate man and his culture from environment and behavior from ecology. They tend to treat them as opposing entities. These views, although much diluted, still have their adherents. Figure 1 exhibits that ecological anthropology studies the interactions between human culture and the environment. Let's understand the environmental determinism. During the first quarter of the 20th century, many scientists adhered to the doctrine of environmental determinism. These scholars believed that the physical environment, especially the climate and terrain, was the active force in shaping culture, emphasizing that humans were essentially a passive product of physical surroundings. As analyzed by Jordan and Rowntree, the logic of the deterministic view considered human equivalent to clay, to be molded by the nature. Similar physical environments were likely to produce similar cultures. Environmental determinists thus viewed human ecology as one-way street. Hussain in 1994 and Jordan and Rowntree in 1990 gave a number of examples of determinist beliefs. Determinists believed that people of the mountains were predestined by the rugged terrain to be simple, backward, conservative and unimaginative and freedom-loving. Dwellers of the deserts were likely to believe in one God but to live under the rule of tyrants. Temperate climate produced inventiveness, industriousness and democracy, whereas the coastland produced great navigators and fishermen. Figure 2 shows that environment determines the cultural factors. Perhaps the most pervasive theme is the belief that the physical environment plays the role of prime mover in human affairs. Personality, morality, politics and government religion, material culture, biology, all of these and more have at one time or another have been subject to explanation by environmental determinism. The humor theory of Hippocrates was probably the single most important foundation for environmental determinism until the 19th century. Hippocrates saw the human body as housing four kinds of humors: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm and blood, representing fire, earth, water and blood respectively. The relative proportion of the four humors caused variation in individual physique and personality as well as in sickness and health. Climate was believed to be responsible for the balance of the humor and therefore for geographic differences in physical form and personality. Therefore, people living in hot climate were passionate, given to violence, lazy, short-lived, light and agile because of an excess of hot air and lack of water. The effect of climate on personality and intelligence determined other human affairs, particularly government and religion. Both Plato and Aristotle associated climate with government, viewing temperate Greece as the ideal climate for democratic government and for producing people fit to rule others. Despotic governments, on the other hand, were best suited for hot climates because the people lacked spirit and a love for liberty and were given to passionate excesses. Cold climate had no real form of government because the people lacked skill and intelligence and were strongly given to a love of individual liberty. The 18th century Frenchman Montesquieu continued this line of reasoning and applied it to religion. Hot climate create lethargy, according this scholar, and are apt to be associated with passive religions. Buddhism in India was given as a classic example. By contrast, Montesquieu believed that religion in cold climate are dominated by aggressiveness to match the love for individual liberty and activity. Christianity, Montesquieu's religion, was elevated above environmental determinism because it was revealed. The geographer Ellsworth Huntington carried this thinking well into the 20th century by arguing in the Mainsprings of Civilization that the highest form of religion are found in temperate regions of the world. His basic argument was that temperate climates are more conducive to intellectual thinking. The 19th and the early 20th centuries brought a decline in the popularity of humor theory, but no less vigorous apologist for environmental determinism. There are several reasons for its persistence. The developing method of science was marked by the search for simple, linear cause and effect relationship, that is, A causes B causes C and so forth. There was no recognition of the complex interaction and feedback processes that make today's science. Anthropologists and geographers searched for the simple causes of geographical distribution of cultural traits. Some proposed environment while others favored diffusion. Both ordered simple, straightforward explanations that were consistent with linear science. Therefore, it is not surprising to see the resurgence of environmental determinism at this time. The rise of technological determinism, as espoused by Marxist social philosophy, also contributed to the resurgence. Environmental determinism was a rebuttal to the anti-environmental position of Marxist writers. Finally, an explanatory model of this kind was the simple way to categorize and explain the mass of data on human diversity being accumulated as a result of word exploration, in much the same way that the 3H system helped classify ancient artifacts. The culture area concept was particularly suitable for this purpose, allowing diverse culture within large geographical areas to be classified into a single type because some traits are held in common. Some early geographers and anthropologists quickly noted the general correspondence between culture areas and natural areas and argued that environment caused the occurrence of distinct cultural areas. Material culture and technology were believed to be the most affected by the environment. For example, in a discussion of the prehistory of American Southwest, William Holmes, a turn-of-the-century anthropologist, states that it is here made manifest that is not so much the capabilities and cultural heritage of the particular stock of people that determines the form of material culture as it is their local environment. However, non-material culture was also explained environmentally. Hodge, in his book Handbook of American Indians North of Mexico, explained with regard to the American Southwest that the effect of this environment were to influence social structure and functions, manners and customs, aesthetic products and motifs, lore and symbolism, and most of all, creed and cult, which were conditioned by the unending, ever-recurring longing for water. Perhaps the most lucid proponent of environmental explanation for non-material culture was given by Fuchs, another turn-of-the-century American anthropologist. He was particularly interested in the origin of ritual behavior. However, unlike most of his contemporaries, Fuchs was aware of the complexities underlying the study of man-environment interaction and did not assume a simple one-to-one relationship. Today, the theme of environmental determinism has been largely replaced by the emergence of man-environmental model that assign environment a limiting but uncreative role or that recognize complex mutual interaction. However, the explanation of biological diversity in humans continue to have a strong deterministic orientation. Models of genetic change in human populations, for instance, are still dominated by the theory of natural selection, a theory that assigns to environment a strong and active role in shaping gene pools. Thus, the most popular explanation for the distribution of skin color is based upon selection for pigment granules that help block out excessive ultraviolet radiation from sun. Models of physiological adaptation to altitude and temperature are also marked by environmental determinism. On the other hand, a number of recent investigators have suggested models that greatly limit the role of environment as an agent of biological changes. Genetic drift due to sampling error in small population is an important part of most of these models. The role of natural selection is particularly being questioned because of the recognition that genes are not isolated entities subject to easy manipulation by environmental factors, but are part of complex system of interaction. Now let's understand environmental possibilism. In place of environmental determinism, a new theory called environmental possibilism was expounded by Forde. The follower of this school asserted that the environment does not directly cause specific cultural developments, but the presence or absence of specific environmental factors placed limit on such development either by permitting or forbidding their occurrence. Toynbee is of the opinion that development of civilization could be explained in terms of their response to environmental challenges. Possibilities do not ignore the influence of the physical environment, and they realize that the imprints of nature shows in many cultures. However, the possibilist stressed that cultural heritage is at least as important as the physical environment in affecting human behavior. Most importantly, the general orientation of environmental explanation in anthropology shifted away from determinism towards possibilism in 1920s and 1930s. Much of this shift was due to the personal influence of Franz Boas, a renowned German-American anthropologist, who showed that the origin of specific cultural features and patterns was generally to be found in historical tradition rather than in environment. Boas emphasized upon specific cultural explanation, which gave rise to the so-called school of historical particularism, a school that has often been chided for its anti-environmentalism. However, Boas did not completely ignore environment and stated that I shall always continue to consider environmental variables as relevant in limiting and modifying existing culture. He did consider it irrelevant to explain the origin of culture trait and that environment plays an important role in explaining why they did occur. This belief is the hallmark of possibilism. Perhaps the most famous example of possibilistic explanation is that posited by Kroeber for the geographical distribution of maize cultivation. Kroeber gave data showing that the distribution of maize farming in Aboriginal North America was restricted to climate with at least a 4-month growing season, during which the rainfall was sufficient and there were no killing frost. A similar study was made by the archaeologist Waldo Wedde, who proposed that on the Aboriginal Great Plains, the geographical boundary of the farming was a function of rainfall. Farming was practiced only in the areas where the mean annual rainfall was sufficiently high to assure the necessary growing season and in areas where drought was not frequent. In areas where the mean annual rainfall was high enough but in which killing drought were frequent, mixed farming and foraging, that is hunting and gathering, were practiced. Finally, in areas with both frequent drought and low average rainfall, only foragers were found. Figure 3 outlines the basic theme of environment possibilism and shows that not only the environment but other factors also determines the culture. Possibilism made significant contribution to the culture area concept. As early as 1896, Otis Mason suggested that the geographical distribution of material culture and technology is molded by the environment but is not caused by it. He defined 12 ethnic environment or cultural areas based upon this assumption. Mason's work was elaborated by Clark and Kroeber. Both recognized a general correlation between cultural areas and natural areas, but viewed the correlation in terms of what cultural features a natural area would or would not permit. Therefore, farming was relevant to the eastern United States not because of the temperature climate, but because it permitted the necessary growing season. Likewise, big game hunting was permitted by the grasslands of the Great Plains. After the introduction of the horse and firearms, but was not caused by it, finally the limited cultural development in Great Basin and other marginal areas was attributed to environmental limitation, while the cultural fluorescence in the southeast United States was attributed to the absence of environmental limitations. Environment, however, could not be used to explain why one culture area was marked by patrilineal inheritance and another by matrilineal inheritance. This could only be explained by cultural history. Thus, Kroeber remarked that while it is true that culture are rooted in the nature and can therefore never be completely understood except with reference to that piece of nature in which they occur, they are no more produced by that nature than a plant is produced or caused by the soil in which it is rooted. The immediate causes of cultural phenomena are other cultural phenomena. The culture area concept therefore developed into a kind of compromise between determinism and the extreme diffusionist views of the culture cries, and related schools. The role of environment in cultural evolution is particularly clear in possibilist thought. Environment places stringent limitation on the level of cultural development. Perhaps the most frequently cited example of this position is taken by the archaeologist Bette Meagher in her 1954 paper, that is Environmental Limitations on the Development of Culture. Meagher suggests that farming is necessary for advanced stages of cultural evolution and that areas suitably for farming is an accurate measure of its potential for cultural evolution. She defines 4 environment types from at least suitable for farming to the most suitable. Number 1, where agriculture is impossible because of temperature, aridity, soil consumption, altitude, topography, latitude or some other natural factor which inhibit the growth of maturation of domesticated plants. Number 2, where agricultural productivity is limited to a relatively low level by climate factors causing rapid depletion of soil fertility. Number 3, where relatively high crop yield can be obtained indefinitely from the same plot of land with fertilization, following crop rotation and other kind of soil restorative measures or in more arid zones by irrigation. And number 4, where little or no specialized knowledge is required to achieve and maintain a stable level of agricultural productivity. These types are not to be constructed as causing cultural evolution. According to Meagher, type 3 and 4 may not reach a high level of development for cultural reasons. For example, the absence of appropriate diffusion. However, no amount of diffusion or other cultural factors can lead to advanced cultural development in a type 1 or type 2 environment. Furthermore, if an advanced culture expand into type 1 or type 2 environment, it is deemed to failure. The most notable application of this model is in the lowland Maya, who occupied a type 2 environment, migrated into the tropical lowlands after achieving the roots of civilization elsewhere. Probably in the highlands of the southern Mexico and Guatemala, reaching maturity in its new home, it suddenly surpassed the farming potential of the poor environment and collapsed. Now let's understand the ecological perspective. Environmental determinism and possibilism have one thing in common: an Aristotelian view of relationship between man and environment, that is, human occupy one sphere and environment another, and never the twain shall meet. The purpose of both the model is to ascertain the impact of one sphere on the other, with the deterministic view holding that environment actively shapes man and the possibilistic view assigning environment as a limiting or selecting role. According to anthropologist Clifford Geertz, with such a formulation, one can ask only the grossest question: how far is culture influenced by the environment? Or how far is the environment modified by the activities of man? Can give only the grossest answer to a degree but not completely. A more precise understanding of relationship between man and the environment is made possible by the non-Aristotelian view that constant interplay takes place and that two distinct spheres do not exist. One cannot be understood without the other. This assumption provided the theoretical foundation of ecology, the third major theme in environmental thought. The word ecology was apparently first coined by German biologist Ernst Haeckel to refer to the way that animals make their living. Above all, the beneficial and inimical relation with other animals and plants, but also including the relationship with the inorganic environment. However, the roots of the ecological orientation are found deep in Western tradition. Indeed, the idea of interplay occurs in the writings of Plato and Aristotle, and later in the literature of the Judeo-Christian. Thus, Aristotle introduced the concept of design in nature, which viewed the earth and universe as a clock-like system having interrelated parts, although parts that were distinct species and driven by different causes. The concept of design in nature was picked up by various Judeo-Christian philosophers and elaborated to suit their purposes, including the substitution of the Aristotelian final cause with the Christian deity as the reason for the design. Clarence James Glackon, a geographer, refers to this school of thought as physic theology and gave the following passage to suggest its prevailing view of the world. The earth as an orderly, well-planned place in which there was nothing wanting, nothing redundant, nothing botching or ill-made. Physic theology took on a more secular orientation with its inclusion into the normal science of the 18th and 19th centuries. The earth and the cosmos were viewed as perfect clockwork-like mechanisms subject to completely predictable natural laws rather than divine purposes. Continuity of the ecological theme into the 19th century is particularly expressed in Charles Darwin's web of concept and in the writings of Baron Alexander Vaughan. According to Darwin, all living creatures must mutually adjust to each other in their struggle for existence in the book Origin of Species, where he gives an example of the web of life as he refers to this relationship. Bumblebees are responsible for pollinating clover field in the English countryside. However, the abundance of the bees is limited by the field mice because they destroy the hives. With fewer bees, less clover is pollinated and the field is not as productive as it might be. However, Darwin observed that clover fields were more productive near villages and towns. The reason for this is that house cats were abundant in these localities and preyed upon the field mice, thus drastically reducing their numbers. With fewer field mice, bumblebees boomed and field blossomed. Humboldt, an early 19th century German naturalist and traveler, had views similar to Darwin. He was particularly interested in the relationship between plants and men in the tropical region of the world. According to Humboldt, man is often responsible for changing the character of native plants by introducing exotics that became dominant, driving the indigenous species out of existence or into remote places. The most typical results was the creation of monotony of the landscape, eliminating natural diversity in favor of few plants useful to men. However, plants have a corresponding impact upon men. Humboldt believed that plant diversity such as that in the tropics stimulated human imagination and artistic sensitivity. Humboldt travelled widely in the American tropics and was quite impressed by the ruins of pre-Columbian civilization in the jungles. It is not surprising that the spectacular remains led him to this conclusion. When men replaced the natural diversity with monotony, the quest for knowledge and artistic endeavour suffered accordingly. Now let's summarize the module. So far we have understood that historically and philosophically speaking, the roots of Western notion of the interrelations between man and environment are very old. What it all amounts to is what has been labeled a super-organic conception of culture. This involves an implicit emphasis on human being and their culture as independent of nature. As a consequence of this perceived dichotomy, explanation of human diversity or unity were to be found either in ultra-human or external conditions. In the first case, the position was one of the biological or psychobiological determinism. In the latter case, the milieu or surrounding was seen as the causal factor. The most widespread of the doctrine based on milieu were the climatic and geographical. Among the proponents of these theories were Aristotle, Hippocrates, Huntington, Montesquieu, Plato and Russell. Some of the scholars classified here as determinist can also be seen as representing the older and partly naive evolutionist and diffusionist position. This is true for Russell and his anthrogeography, as well as for Adolphe Bastien and his emphasis on parallelism in human societal environment. At this point, it is only correct and fair to point out that the possibilist characterization of the so-called naive linear deterministic view is at best an oversimplification. All in all, the crude deterministic argument was, however, rather naive. It was clear that it would sooner or later have to be challenged. In general, Friedrich Russell, a German geographer during the 20th century, have said that all human activities were determined by the environment. Environment has influenced men, and it is the environment that sets human culture. For example, Eskimos are nomads living in an Arctic region and are still primitive because of their harsh environmental condition or extreme cold environment. On the other hand, there is environmental possibilism, where it says environmental factors develop the human culture, but there are certain environment factors that restrict the development of human culture or technology. For example, in temperate region, it is very favorable for the development of agriculture, whereas in Arctic region, because of the environmental condition, there is no development of agriculture. Likewise, in islands and landlocked states, people living in the islands have developed the technology of making boats and ships, whereas settlers in the landlocked state do not have the capability. Thus, one should not generate the environmental condition, as different places have different environmental condition with different people. So, the effect of influence of the environment differ from place to place. Thank you.